Well, I'm super excited to be here hanging out with you. Now, it's been a year, but this volleyball team, yeah, back in the front row. I love it. Listen, I've got a bunch of kids. I got 5 kids, and they love living at the beach. As Dr. Parrott said, we've been down at the beach for about 3 years, and it's been a really cool transition for our kids because we used to live in Las Vegas, and there's no water in Las Vegas. So we've gone from the desert, if we wanted to hit the beach, it's like a 4-hour drive over Santa Monica Pier, over to the ocean, which has been pretty great. I know he asked, but did any of you guys make it down south a little bit for the beach for spring break? It's like 3 of you? What'd you do? Where you going, man? So how many just stuck around here for spring break? You just hung out here? Okay, no one went to the beach and no one hung out here. Okay, well, I've got 5 kids and they're loving the beach. My oldest is 11. He's about to be 12. So he's a weird kid. And I'm saying that very affectionately. We were all weird at 12, weren't we, right? Finding out all kinds of stuff about ourselves, right? Thinking about other people. You just kind of forming your identity. Certain things that you think are hilarious aren't, and you're testing out your material on people all the time. I was with my son. I'm warning you, ladies, right now. I just saw myself spit. I'm warning you. All right. So, I was standing with my son. There's adults at my house, and he's around adults a lot. It's part of being a pastor's kid. And the advantage of our kids, that they grew up pastor's kids in a bar, which isn't that, the stigma changes a little bit when you grow up attending a church in a bar. But and so he's around adults a lot. That's kind of the nature of being my son. He's around a lot of adults, and he's a pretty good kid. He's a real intelligent kid, loves to read, and got a good vocabulary, so he can handle his own. But my son, when he's communicating, he's got a great imagination. I'll just say that. I don't know how else to say it. So if he's talking about a cat, which he happened to be doing in this situation, talking to a friend, he'll subconsciously, he'll go like this. And he'll start talking to you about a cat because I don't know where he gets that from, I know my arms are all over the place. But just the other day, he was at the house and he was explaining how our dog, we had a big boxer for a while, and ran underneath him and knocked him over. And as loud as he could scream, he reenacted that, which took in real life 10 seconds. He reenacted it. It took him about a minute. He drew the whole thing out over about a minute. And so he's a very expressive young man, and he's learning new words. Some I'm not super excited about, that he's asking me about these words, and he'll mouth the swear word, that he heard at school. Dad, I don't want to say this out loud in front of my brothers, so he'll come and ask me what it is. And to hear that word come flying out of an 11-year-old's mouth it's both comical and frightening, So he started using this word that we all know, but he didn't know what it meant. And so he started saying, it was this past winter, it's December, it's chilly out, right? Down at the beach, at least, we get a lot of that, the wind coming off the Gulf, and it's a little bit cold. And so we're driving in the car. We just get in the car. He's bundled up. He's like, oh man, it's freezing. How ironic. I was like, okay. I just let it go, I just kind of let it go. So it wasn't that long later, we're having dinner. And this is maybe a week later. And he, now I know, as soon as he said it, I thought, this kid has no clue what that means. But how often is an 11-year-old going to use the word ironic in a sentence, period, So you just kind of let it go. So it was maybe a week or two later, we're having dinner, and his food is steaming, and he takes a big bite, and I knew but it was slow motion. It was kind of like, oh, you're about to, but I kind of wanted to see what was going to happen, So he took this big bite, and I knew right when we put his eyes got big. He goes, oh, this is burning my mouth. How ironic. All right, buddy, we need to have a convo about your verbiage, your vocab. It's a word that, to him it felt right, how ironic, it was almost like an expressive word, expressive word. But it obviously did not mean what it has meant. And I've been thinking about this very interesting word really, if you were here last year, you found out I get obsessed over things, and I can't let things go. I think about it a lot, and I'm a little selfish in my conversation, so whatever you're talking about, I don't care. I want to talk about the thing that's been going on in my head for 6 months, because it helps me process through that. And I've been kind of obsessed with this word for like the last 6 months. Now, the interesting thing about this word is we don't know who first came up with the word. We know about when. It's a word that's a couple thousand years old, actually. It was created about the middle of the very first century, but we don't know exactly when. We don't know exactly who said it. The good news, we know the town that it came out of. It's this little city called Antioch. And for the very first time, this word was uttered. And for the most documentation that we've got, we know it was sometime before the year AD 60, about that time. Now, it was a descriptive word. It was a word used to describe someone, or you could say a group of someones, right? And here's the word. I want to throw the word up on the screen. That's the word. That word was first used the very first century by a group of people, non-believers, non-Christ followers, non-church people, and they were trying to come up with a way to describe this other group of people. There was this group of people that lived a certain way, and they lived that way. It was a little bit different than the way that these other people were living, and so they tagged them with this word. It's not an unfamiliar word, but what's interesting about this word to me is if you take this word and you ask people in this room to define what this means or what is a Christian, you're going to get more than one answer. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? And the reason you're going to get more than one answer is because you and I were all brought up different ways around different people, maybe in different Christian gatherings, or you're around a group of people that claimed Christian and they expressed to you or modeled for you or told you what it means to be Christian. Now, that's just in this room. There's all kinds of definitions here in this room. Get outside this room for a moment and just go somewhere in this community. You don't have to leave this community. And ask some people, what does it mean to you to be Christian? And you're going to find, oddly enough, there's going to be all kinds. They're going to pronounce the word the same. They're going to spell it the same. But they're going to have a different definition. Now, if you get outside this community and you go all over the United States, you will find definitions ranging from one end of the spectrum to another. This country, within our own country, will have massively different definitions. Get outside the country, you go around the world, they'll know what you mean when you say Christian. They'll have heard the word. Most places, not all places, but most places will have heard the word Christian before, and they'll pronounce it similar, spell it the same, and they'll have a different definition of what that word actually means. That's very interesting to me. How a word that for most of us is a very common, take for granted word can have that many different definitions depending on who you talk to. And listen, I get it. I grew up in what would be considered a non-Christian home. I didn't grow up around people who claimed the name of Christ. Now, I knew some people that said that they were Christian, or I knew that they attended a gathering. Usually that gathering happened on the weekend, a Sunday morning thing, and they all called themselves Christian, but I had an opinion about who they were based on who they were, right? And then that definition kind of got cemented in my brain. What does it mean to be Christian? What's very interesting to me over the 2,000 years, how many definitions have come to mean something you join. How the word Christian has become a religion that we jump in on. If you believe a certain number of things at that Christian gathering, that faith community, you say, okay, I agree with this, this, and this. I will join this Christian community. We would call it church, or maybe it's a group study of some kind. And so we join Christianity. If people were to ask you what religion you are, if you're a follower of Jesus, you follow that question up with the answer, I'm Christian. It's become a religion to join rather than a word to describe a person or a group of people based on what? Well, the word Christian, that little I-A-N at the end of the word Christ, means to belong to. It's not much different than like you belong maybe to a certain political party, especially of that day, that first century, I'm of a certain political party or a certain group of people. That I-A-N would follow and would denote the fact that you belong to that group. And it says something about you. And the word Christian is supposed to say something about us, but it has oftentimes, and it's not, I realize that not for all of us, but oftentimes it's become something we join rather than someone we are. So here's what I learned growing up, that a Christian is a certain thing. And I was a part of this faith gathering. I started kind of hanging out around church people, around Christian gatherings late in high school. And what kind of blew my mind was what they said it was. And if you agreed with whatever, with the tenets of faith or the Sunday morning preaching, if you agreed, you stayed and you were Christian. You were kind of on the inside of that group. And if you were a really devoted Christian, you went a lot to church. You know, we had Sunday morning services, Wednesday night youth group. And if you were really a Christian, you went. Not only did you went, you got involved and served. And what was odd to me is that this group of Christians, they claimed, we're a Christian church, but they believed differently than the Christian church down the road. It was to me, not having a frame of reference, it became very odd to me. I wasn't like angry about it, or I wasn't trying to figure out who was right and who was wrong. It just became odd to me. It became odd to me that this group of Christian people could believe so differently than this group of Christian people that had a Christian gathering a mile down the road from each other, both claiming Christian. And what began to be very evident to me is what was important to that group of people and what wasn't important to that group of people. And what seemed to be most important to this group, some of it was important to that group. I don't know if you guys have ever watched American Ninja Warrior, right? I love that show. And I've been able to go to a couple finales because they're filmed in Las Vegas. And I used to live there. And so right in the middle, kind of south and east of the Strip, the Las Vegas Strip, there was this big, bright craziness, which usually is a dark area, kind of a flat desert area. And it was bright for a certain amount of time because right there is where they were doing the live American Ninja Warrior finales. I love that show. And what's interesting about that, if you follow it, if you really, really watch it often, I know you guys have nothing else going on in your lives, so I'm sure you're glued to the TV all the time. But to get through to the next deal, you've got to traverse some obstacles, right? You've got to go on this thing where you jump back, right? Jump back and forth. I could do it if I was there. And then you've got to go do something with your upper body, and you got to grab onto this log, and you got to climb a rope, and you've got to, and you're hanging barely on by your fingertips, right? Now, that's really good. You do a great job if you can go up that warped wall thing at the end and smack the button, smoke flies, everyone's cheering for you, make it super dramatic. But if you get through that, you got to go on to the next thing. The next thing has a few more obstacles to get through, you know what I mean? It's a little bit, the whole course is a little bit longer. And then the next course a little bit longer. I'm not sure how many, those of you dedicated fans would know, but I'm not sure how many you have to go through, how many of those rounds you have to go through till you get to the very finale. The final is this really long. It had all the hard things from all the other deals, and you've got to get through it. And this group, this first one was difficult, And if you can do this, you go on to the next one. But the next one has all of this plus a few more. That's what I felt like church was for me. That's what I felt like what it meant to be Christian. This group, you've got to do these things. And it could be 6 things that you need to do, 6 hoops you need to jump through, 6 membership classes you have to go through. You have to do these things. And if you do these things, believe and behave this way, then you get to be in. But then the next group has 3 more hoops you got to jump through. And you've got to traverse on your fingertips this time rather than having these big rings that you jump around. And then so this group said, yeah, we like that stuff, but if you really want to be Christian, those guys, they got some of it down, but this Christian thing, you got to add, you got to do a little bit more. It seems like it was never enough. Because the next group I hung out with, they had a few more obstacles. They got rid of some of those things. We don't like what they do here, here, and here. We'll keep a couple of those things. We're going to add our few things into this mix. And that's what it means to be Christian. One word, so many definitions. Now, before that word started being used commonplace, the writers of the Bible began to kind of unpack what it actually meant to be Christian. Without even having to use the word, there was this church leader named Saul, and this church leader became to believe that Jesus was actually the Messiah. He was the deliverer. He was the savior of all of humanity, and he became a Jesus follower. He wasn't using the word Christian yet. Matter of fact, Jesus never even used the word. The disciples, the writers of the New Testament, they never even used the word, unless Luke did once when he wrote down that it was first used in Antioch. And so it wasn't a word that they used. They weren't gathered together trying to label it. What do we call our gang, man? What are we going to call ourselves here? They could care less. They weren't thinking about it, talking about it, voting on it. They were just living a certain way. And because they lived a certain way, they were called that. And this guy, Saul, who later we come to know as Paul, who wrote so many beautiful letters to his Christ-following friends, wrote a letter to a group of people in Rome. And they very cleverly named it Romans. And within that letter to that group of people, without having to use the word Christian, he lays out the type of life that others looked at and said, whoa, those people belong to Christ. And I want to read that with you. It's in the book of Romans, the letter written to Romans. In the 14th chapter, it says this: "For we don't live for ourselves or die for ourselves. If we live, it's to honor the Lord. If we die, it's to honor the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord." How profound and deep and heavy and weighty and simple, and how not full of hoops is that? Because oftentimes we get asked questions and we get into conversations about what it means to be Christian that actually were never part of the conversation originally. And we're labeled Christian or not, and if we are Christian, then we're required to kind of stay in the group to vote a certain way and to believe a certain thing. And if you don't, you are quickly pushed on the outside of everything that's considered Christian. And then the conversation on top of that, this gets brought in, and then those other few ideas and persuasions and thoughts and theology, they get jumbled up into this word that we have called Christian, and it's like it's been hijacked away from belonging to Christ. The right question is not, now it's supposed to be the same question. The question is, are you a Christian? That's the right question, but what we're supposed to really be answering is, does our life belong to Christ? Does our life belong to Christ? Because this group of people that were looking out and looking at these Christians weren't trying to figure out how they were voting. They weren't trying to figure out their politics or their statements of faith. It was just so obvious that these people, their lives belonged to Jesus Christ. He was not an object over here. So I've got I'm getting old, guys. I'm 40 years old, right, this year. And I know you can't even imagine what that world even looks like, being 40 years old. I remember not being 40, thinking, oh my God, life is over. About 39, flipping. I'm 39, about to be 40. And I've accumulated in my life some objects, right? So I've got some stuff. Now, there's some close people in my life, my wife, and I've got, like I mentioned, 5 kids. I've got this cute little schnauzer dog at my house, and we've got a house, and we've got a vehicle, and because I've got a house, I've got some furniture in it, and things like that. And pretty soon, depending on how we view the word Christian, or you could say God, becomes just another object in our lives. I've got a car, I've got a couch, I've got this rug, I've got God, I've got a microwave and an oven, and so God becomes like this random object in our lives. I've got 999 objects, and then at some point, I got God, and He's number 1,000 object in my life. And then as my life goes on, my assumption is I'm going to accumulate some other things in my life. So God gets kind of thrown in there as some kind of random object in my life. It's just, I've kind of got that religion, Jesus, God, Christian thing going on. But I've got all these other things. That's not really who I am. But for that group of people, Christ was more than some random object in their lives. In fact, He was the center of who they were. Paul, this same writer of the book of Romans, did something really crazy. He tried to sum up his life. Now, imagine for just a moment you've got this task, and however many years you've been on this earth, you had to write out your life on one single 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. That's your task. You got one shot. You can't go on. You can't staple more to the back, nothing. This is it, one sheet. You can write as small as you want to, or you can type, whatever. But imagine trying to fit your whole life on a piece of paper. It's a little depressing, even the thought of it, to be honest with you. I've read biographies, people's life stories, and even a big, thick book. You can't get someone's whole life in a book on some pages. You can get some of it, but imagine you trying to sum up your whole life on a page. You'd be able to get some details in there, but you're hitting major stuff, where I'm from, and maybe what my family was like when I was born, and then you kind of just start going throughout, and you're hitting highlights. Before you know it, you're at the end of the page, and that's your whole life summed up on a page. But imagine if you had to take that one page, which was already be a difficult task, and you had to shrink it down to a paragraph. Try to fit your whole life in a paragraph. That's tough. You're hitting highlights only, 5-6 sentences. Now imagine you had to take that paragraph, which was once a page. The page wasn't even long enough. Now you're down to a paragraph. That paragraph is way too short to sum up who you are. You're more than that paragraph, right? We would all agree with that. You're more than that paragraph. You're more than that book, if a whole book was written about you. But you take that paragraph and you get it down to a sentence. Imagine if you had to, what you started with this whole life, page, paragraph, sentence. Imagine if you had to try to sum up your whole life in a word. That would be pretty fun to go around and find out what your word would be, right? And it may change moment to moment, day to day, year to year. But what would your life look like if it was summed up in a word? Paul did it in a very interesting way. He writes in this letter to his friends who had visited several years earlier in the city called Philippi. He writes this to them. It's a very short verse, Philippians chapter 1. It's the very beginning of his letter. He says this, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Hey guys, heads up, if I were to die right now, I would gain so much. It would be a loss to my friends and all of that stuff, but it'd be such a gain to me. But let me just tell you, I've lived X amount of years on this earth, and if I were to sum up what life is to me, I've got a singular word that I would use, and that word is Christ. Because Christ isn't a random object in my life. He is the core and the center of my life. My life belongs to Him, and if I live, it's to honor the Lord. If I die, that's going to honor the Lord too. So whether I live or whether I die, it's to honor the Lord. But somehow, somewhere, the word Christian got hijacked to mean something else. I mentioned I'm a little bit older than you guys, and when I'll say it this way, I can remember when Michael Jackson's song Bad came out. That's how old I am. And man, everyone was listening, everybody. There wasn't a person that didn't know that song. But something very interesting happened that day. There was a day when the word bad meant not good. That's actually what it actually meant. When you said something, this is bad, it meant bad. And then that song, literally one song changed it all. Bad, all of a sudden, didn't just mean something else. It meant the opposite of what it meant. And parents' brains were exploding all over the country when their kid was like, oh, Mom, this casserole is bad. And they were crying, and what, Mom? No, it's bad, it's good. They said it was bad. I did, Mom, I did. It changed the meaning of a word. A single song changed the meaning of the word. And all these years later, you can use that word to mean both good and bad. The word bad. The whole meaning changed. And you heard it from somebody else who heard it from someone else my age. And now it has a different meaning than it used to once have. And I fear that the word Christian has been so hijacked that it no longer means what it means. That it means something else. It has become a religion to join rather than a life we live. It's become about hoops we jump through and political opinions. It's become something else. So the question, I told you, for about 6 months I've been wrestling with this word. The question that could easily be asked is, am I Christian? And depending on what my definition of that word is, I could say yes or no. Now, I could say yes depending on my definition, but your definition I may not be, because the definitions have been so skewed. What the question we're really asking ourselves when we ask, am I Christian? Here's the real question is, does my life belong to Christ? Well, what about, no. Hey, let's not what about this thing into a different definition. Does my life belong to Christ, or is he just another object in my life, one of many that I'm carrying around in my life? And one of a few that I'll accumulate again one day, and I'll have a whole bag of things, and one of those things just happens to be God. Well, what if there were no what-abouts? And when it comes to our theology about being a Christian, belonging to Christ, what if it just meant our lives belong to Christ, and it was that simple, but yet that weighty and profound? So, I want to ask you to join me in asking ourselves if we're Christians in a different way. I don't want to get into a theological debate because that's not what it means to be Christian. I don't want to know about your politics because that's not what it means to be Christian. What it means to be Christian is the question that we have to ask ourselves is not what we attend, but does my life belong to Christ?